Keiko Tanaka had always been the quiet one. While her siblings travelled the world and started families, she found comfort in the orderly world of books and library shelves. At 28, she lived alone in her grandmother Hana's traditional house in Shirakawa, a mountain town where cherry blossoms painted the streets pink each spring. 3 days had passed since the funeral, and the house still felt too empty, too silent. Grandmother Hana had been 92 when she died peacefully in her sleep, taking with her decades of stories that Keiko now wished she had asked about. Among Hana's belongings, wrapped carefully in silk cloth, Keiko found an old brass compass. The metal felt warm in her palm, worn smooth by countless hands. But when she opened it, something was wrong. The needle didn't point north. Instead, it swung steadily toward the east, toward the old shrine at the edge of town, as if it knew something she didn't. Keiko turned the compass over in her hands, studying its surface. Tiny engravings covered the brass, so worn she could barely make them out. Was that a mountain? A bird in flight? She had always assumed it was just an old keepsake, something her grandfather might have used for hiking the mountain trails. But now, watching the needle's steady pull toward the east, she felt the first stirring of something she hadn't experienced in years, genuine curiosity about something beyond her predictable routine. The compass seemed to pulse with purpose, as if it had been waiting patiently for her to notice. Keiko had grown up hearing fragments of stories about the war years, whispered conversations between Hana and the other elderly women at the market. But those were just stories, weren't they? Old memories that grew more dramatic with each telling. Yet this compass felt different. It felt important. It felt like the beginning of something. Shirakawa had barely changed since Keiko's childhood. The same narrow streets wound between wooden houses with their overhanging second stories and small gardens bursting with spring vegetables. Mountain streams ran alongside the stone pathways, carrying snowmelt from the peaks that still wore caps of white. Cherry trees lined every street, their branches heavy with blossoms that the morning breeze sent dancing through the air like confetti. Most of the younger residents had moved to larger cities for work, leaving behind a community of elderly shopkeepers, retired farmers, and people like Keiko, who found peace in the town's unhurried rhythm. She knew every face, every garden, every stone in the old shrine's path. Or so she had thought. The compass in her pocket seemed to whisper that there were secrets hidden in this familiar place, waiting for someone brave enough to look for them. Keiko had never considered herself particularly brave, but something about the morning light and the compass's mysterious pull made her feel like maybe today could be different. The shrine stood where it had for 300 years, its red torii gate bright against the green mountainside. Stone steps, worn smooth by generations of visitors, led up through a grove of ancient cherry trees. Keiko had climbed these steps countless times as a child, sometimes with her grandmother, sometimes alone when she needed to think. The compass grew warmer in her hand as she approached, its needle pointing steadily toward the main shrine building. Morning mist swirled around the weathered stone lanterns, and the only sounds were her footsteps on the stones and the distant call of a mountain bird. At the shrine's base, where offerings of rice and flowers were left by daily visitors, Keiko knelt and watched the compass. The needle quivered, then pointed down, toward the loose stones at the foundation's edge. She had never noticed before how different these stones looked from the others, as if they had been placed recently, or perhaps moved and replaced. Her heart began to beat faster. Whatever her grandmother's compass wanted her to find, it was here, hidden beneath these ordinary-looking stones. The stones came away easier than Keiko expected, as if they had been moved many times before. Beneath them, wrapped in oiled cloth that still kept out the moisture, was a small metal box about the size of her palm. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted it free. The box was heavier than it looked, made of brass that matched her compass, and it carried the same warmth. Inside the shrine grounds, she felt safe from curious eyes as she carefully opened the latch. The contents took her breath away. A letter written in her grandmother's younger handwriting, the ink faded but still legible, dated September 15, 1943. Promise kept, it read, signed simply with H. Beneath the letter was a hand-drawn map showing mountain paths she didn't recognize, marked with symbols and notations in the same careful script. The map showed routes through the mountains, connecting Shirakawa to villages she knew existed but had never visited. Some paths were marked with small crosses, others with circles. At the bottom, in her grandmother's handwriting, "For those who remember the way home." Keiko's mind raced as she walked back toward town. She needed someone who had known her grandmother during the war years, someone who might understand what these documents meant. The obvious choice was Hiroshi Matsuda, the retired postmaster who had delivered mail in Shirakawa for 50 years. If anyone would know about routes through the mountains, about messages passed between villages during wartime, it would be him. But as she approached his small house behind the old post office, she noticed something that made her pause. Through his window, she could see Hiroshi watching her approach, and even from a distance, his expression looked worried, not curious, not friendly worried, as if he had been expecting this moment and dreading it. When she knocked on his door, it took him a long time to answer. When he finally appeared, his usual warm smile was strained, and his eyes immediately went to the papers in her hands. "Keiko-chan," he said quietly, "perhaps you should come inside. We need to talk about what you found, and why some stones are better left unturned." Hiroshi's house smelled of green tea and old paper, comforting scents that reminded Keiko of childhood visits when he would give her candy from behind the post office counter. But today, the familiar surroundings felt charged with tension. He prepared tea with shaking hands, and when he finally sat across from her, his usual stories about postal routes and mountain weather were replaced by heavy silence. "Your grandmother," he began slowly, "was not the simple farmer's wife everyone believed her to be." He paused, studying Keiko's face, as if deciding how much truth she could handle. During the war years, Hana helped people travel through the mountains. Not tourists or family visitors, you understand. People who needed to disappear, people who were in great danger. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "The compass you found, it was given to her by someone she helped, someone who promised to return someday." Hiroshi's eyes filled with tears he had clearly been holding back for decades. "She made me promise to keep her secret, even after death, but perhaps the time for secrets has finally passed." From a wooden box he kept behind his tea supplies, Hiroshi withdrew a photograph so faded that Keiko had to squint to make out the details. But when she did, her heart stopped. There was her grandmother, perhaps 20 years old, standing in what looked like a forest clearing. Beside her were 3 men in torn uniforms that didn't look Japanese. One man had his arm in a makeshift sling. Another leaned heavily on a walking stick. All 3 looked exhausted but hopeful, and young Hana stood among them like a guardian angel, her hand resting protectively on the shoulder of the youngest man. "Allied prisoners," Hiroshi whispered. "Shot down over the mountains. Your grandmother found them half dead from cold and hunger. Instead of turning them in, she nursed them back to health and helped them escape." He pointed to the youngest man in the photo. "That one there," he gave her the compass, "said it would always point toward hope, toward safety, toward home. He promised he would come back for her after the war ended." Hiroshi's voice broke slightly, but sometimes promises take 70 years to keep. Emma Chen had been visiting mountain towns throughout central Japan for 3 months, following rumors and fragmented records about resistance networks that most historians claimed never existed. As a third-generation Chinese, American researcher, she specialized in untold stories of wartime cooperation between Asian communities and Allied forces. Her grandfather had been helped by someone in this region during 1943, but family records were incomplete, names were lost, and official documentation was deliberately destroyed. When she heard about the small mountain town of Shirakawa, something in the description made her pack her research materials and make the trip. The town was beautiful, peaceful, and seemed unlikely to harbour any dramatic secrets. But Emma had learned that the most extraordinary stories often hid in the most ordinary places. As she walked toward the shrine that locals had recommended as historically significant, she noticed a young Japanese woman sitting on the steps, staring at what looked like an old compass with an expression of complete bewilderment. Emma's researcher instincts immediately told her that this woman had found something important. "Excuse me," Emma said gently, approaching with the careful politeness her mother had taught her for speaking with strangers. I couldn't help but notice you seem to have found something interesting. Keiko looked up, startled, clutching the compass protectively against her chest. But something in Emma's voice, genuine curiosity rather than nosiness, made her relax slightly. I'm a historian, Emma continued, settling onto the shrine steps at a respectful distance. I research stories from the war years, particularly about people who helped others escape danger. That compass looks like it might have quite a story. For a moment, Keiko hesitated. She had spent her whole life keeping things to herself, avoiding attention, staying safely invisible. But looking at Emma's open, interested face, she felt an unexpected urge to share this burden of discovery. My grandmother left this to me, she said slowly. But it doesn't work like a normal compass. And I think she might have had secrets I never knew about. Emma's eyes lit up with the kind of excitement that only comes from years of searching for exactly this type of breakthrough. May I ask what kind of secrets? Keiko had just begun explaining about the hidden box and Hiroshi's revelations when she heard familiar footsteps on the shrine path, heavy, purposeful steps that belonged to someone who was not happy. She turned to see her Uncle Taro approaching, his business suit looking out of place among the ancient stones and cherry blossoms. His face wore the expression she remembered from childhood arguments, stern, disappointed, and completely certain that he was right about everything. Keiko, he called out before he had even reached them. What are you doing here, and who is this? His tone made it clear that he considered both the location and the company inappropriate. Emma stood politely and introduced herself, but Taro barely acknowledged her greeting. His attention was fixed entirely on his niece, and specifically on the papers and compass in her hands. I heard from Hiroshi that you've been asking questions about grandmother's war stories, he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. This needs to stop immediately. Some things are better left buried, Keiko. Some stories only bring trouble to families who have worked hard to build respectable lives. Uncle Taro, Keiko said, and something in her voice surprised all three of them. It was steadier than usual, clearer, more certain. Grandmother left me this compass for a reason. If she wanted her stories to stay buried, she wouldn't have hidden clues for me to find. Taro's face darkened. You don't understand the consequences of stirring up old trouble. Our family has a good reputation in this community. I have a successful business. Your cousins are doing well in school. Why would you risk all of that for some romantic fantasy about the war? Emma watched the exchange with professional interest, recognizing the familiar pattern of families divided over how to handle difficult histories. She had seen this conflict in Chinese, American families, Korean families, every community that had survived trauma and had to decide between remembering and forgetting. Sometimes, Emma said gently, the stories our grandparents leave behind aren't just about the past. Sometimes they're about who we're supposed to become. Taro turned his sharp gaze on her. And sometimes strangers should mind their own business. The compass in Keiko's hand grew warm, and the needle began pointing toward a new direction entirely. The compass needle swung decisively toward the west, pointing across the valley toward a cluster of buildings that Keiko knew was the village of Takayama. She had been there only once as a child, for a summer festival, but she remembered the steep mountain path that connected the two communities. It's pointing to Takayama, she said wonderingly. But why would grandmother want me to go there? Emma pulled out her notebook and began sketching the direction and approximate distance. In my research, I found that resistance networks often connected multiple villages. If your grandmother was helping people escape, she wouldn't have worked alone. She would have needed safe houses, trusted contacts, places where people could rest and resupply. Taro made a sound of exasperation. This is exactly what I was afraid of. Now you want to drag other communities into this nonsense. Keiko, I'm telling you as your elder and as someone who cares about this family. Stop this investigation before it causes real harm. But Keiko was no longer listening to her uncle's warnings. For the first time in her life, she felt like she was being called to something important, something that mattered more than staying safe and invisible. The compass seemed to pulse with urgency, as if time were running out for secrets that had waited 70 years to be told. The path to Takayama followed an ancient route that traders and pilgrims had used for centuries. Stone markers worn smooth by weather marked the way, and mountain streams provided music for the journey. Emma proved to be an excellent walking companion, her questions about local history helping Keiko see familiar landscapes with new eyes. "Your grandmother would have known this path well," Emma observed as they crossed a wooden bridge over a particularly scenic stream. During wartime, when official transportation was monitored, routes like this would have been invaluable for moving people safely. Keiko tried to imagine her young grandmother making this journey in darkness, perhaps leading exhausted prisoners towards safety. The image seemed impossible. Hannah had been such a small, quiet woman, always concerned with proper tea service and maintaining her garden. Yet the evidence was mounting that this gentle lady had possessed extraordinary courage. As they climbed higher, Keiko realized that with each step away from Shirakawa, she was also stepping away from the safe, predictable life she had always known. The compass in her pocket seemed to approve, its warm weight a constant reminder that some journeys were worth taking, even when you couldn't see the destination. The farmhouse sat in a hollow between hills, surrounded by what had once been carefully tended fields, but was now a wild meadow dotted with mountain flowers. The building itself looked solid, despite decades of abandonment, its traditional wooden frame still standing straight against the mountain weather. As they approached, Keiko noticed details that seemed deliberate: a well-maintained path leading to the door despite the overgrown garden, windows that were shuttered but not broken, a roof that looked recently patched. "Someone's been taking care of this place," Emma observed, running her hand along the smooth wooden door frame, "not living here, but maintaining it." The compass in Keiko's hand was practically vibrating now, its needle pointing directly at the farmhouse's front door. When they tried the latch, it opened easily, as if it had been waiting for them. The interior was clean, dust-free, and furnished simply but comfortably. Fresh tatami mats covered the floors, and the air smelled of recent cleaning rather than abandonment. On a low table in the center of the main room, someone had left a thermos of hot tea, still steaming, and a note written in Hiroshi's careful handwriting, "For those who follow the compass home." Behind a sliding panel that Emma discovered by accident, leaning against what she thought was a solid wall, lay a room that seemed frozen in time. Wooden crates lined the walls, filled with supplies that someone had carefully maintained for decades. There were blankets, canned goods with labels in multiple languages, medical supplies, clothing in various sizes, and most remarkably, a collection of maps showing every mountain path within 50 kilometers. Photographs pinned to one wall showed dozens of people, some in military uniforms, others in civilian clothes, all with the exhausted but grateful expressions of people who had found safety after great danger. In the center of the collection was a larger photograph that made Keiko gasp. It showed her grandmother, maybe 25 years old, standing with a group of villagers in front of this very farmhouse. They were holding lanterns, and their faces showed the quiet determination of people engaged in dangerous but necessary work. At the bottom of the photo, someone had written, "Shirakawa Takayama Network, 1943, never forgotten." Emma carefully examined each photograph, her trained historian's eye cataloguing details. "This is incredible," she whispered. "This is evidence of a resistance network that saved dozens of lives. And it all centered around your grandmother." Among all the photographs, one stood out with startling clarity. It showed Hannah standing very close to a young Western man, both of them looking directly at the camera with expressions that spoke of deep understanding and affection. The man wore a partial military uniform, American, Emma thought, and carried himself with the careful posture of someone recovering from injury. But what struck Keiko most powerfully was the way they stood together, not touching, but clearly connected, their faces showing the kind of bond that forms between people who have shared danger and depended completely on each other for survival. On the back of the photograph, in her grandmother's young handwriting, was a name, Robert Sullivan, Canada, promised to return. Below that, a date, September 20, 1943, and then, heartbreakingly, if he finds his way home, Tell him I will wait." Emma studied the photograph with professional interest, but Keiko felt something much more personal. This wasn't just historical documentation, this was evidence of a love story that had been interrupted by war, a promise that had somehow never been fulfilled. The compass in her hand seemed to grow heavier, as if it carried the weight of all those years of waiting, all those decades of wondering what might have been. As darkness settled over the mountains, Emma and Keiko spread the maps and documents across the farmhouse table, working by the warm light of the oil lamps. What emerged was the outline of a sophisticated operation that had operated for nearly 2 years during the war's most dangerous period. "Look at this," Emma said, tracing routes on one of the hand-drawn maps. "Your grandmother wasn't just helping the occasional prisoner or refugee. This was organized resistance, with safe houses, communication networks, supply caches, and backup routes if the primary paths were compromised. The scale of it was breathtaking. Routes connected not just Shirakawa and Takayama, but 5 other mountain villages, creating a network that can move people safely across nearly 100 kilometers of dangerous territory. Each route was marked with symbols indicating supply caches, friendly houses, and dangerous areas to avoid. She was the central coordinator, Keiko realized, studying her grandmother's notations on the margins of maps. "All these routes lead back to Shirakawa, back to our house." Emma nodded. "And this, Robert Sullivan, he wasn't just someone she helped escape. He was her partner in organizing this entire network. The compass was his way of ensuring you could find all of this someday, even if he never made it back to explain it himself." The walk back to Shirakawa felt different than the journey out. Keiko's mind buzzed with everything they had discovered, but underneath the excitement was a growing sense of responsibility. These weren't just interesting historical artifacts, they were evidence of her grandmother's extraordinary courage and sacrifice. They were proof that ordinary people could do remarkable things when the situation demanded it. Emma walked beside her in comfortable silence, occasionally pointing out constellations that were visible only in these remote mountains, far from city lights. "What will you do with all this?" Emma finally asked as they neared the village lights. It was a question Keiko had been avoiding, but she knew the answer was already forming in her heart. "I think I need to understand the whole story," she said slowly. "Not just what happened, but what it meant to grandmother, what it cost her, why she kept it secret for so long." The compass in her pocket had grown quiet, its needle now pointing steadily back toward Shirakawa, back toward home. But Keiko suspected that its work wasn't finished yet. There were still pieces missing from this puzzle, still questions that needed answers. And somewhere, she was beginning to suspect, there might still be someone alive who remembered making a promise to return. Hiroshi was waiting for her. As Keiko approached his house the next morning, carrying the maps and photographs they had discovered, she could see him standing in his doorway with an expression that mixed resignation with what might have been relief. "You found the farmhouse," he said simply. It wasn't a question. "I've been maintaining it for 30 years, just as I promised her I would, just as my father maintained it for 20 years before me." He gestured for her to come inside, and when they were seated at his familiar table, he poured tea with hands that were no longer shaking. "Your grandmother made 3 of us promise to keep her secret," he said. "Myself, my father, and one other person you haven't met yet. We swore we would maintain the evidence, keep the routes clear, and wait. She said someday someone would come looking for the truth, someone with a compass, someone who needed to know." He studied Keiko's face carefully. "She said it might be Robert Sullivan, coming back to fulfill his promise, or it might be you, needing to understand who she really was. Either way, we were to help them find all the pieces of the story." Hiroshi smiled for the first time since this had all begun. "I think she would be proud that it was you who came looking." Behind Hiroshi's house, concealed beneath what looked like an ordinary tool shed, was another cache of materials that took Keiko's breath away. These were more personal items, letters written in multiple languages, small pieces of jewelry and religious items that had belonged to the people Hana helped, and most remarkably, a radio set that had clearly been used for coordinated communication. "The network was larger than just your grandmother's village connections," Hiroshi explained, carefully lifting out a leather portfolio filled with documents. She was in contact with resistance groups as far south as Nagoya and as far north as Sendai. This radio let her coordinate safe passage across the entire central mountain region. Emma examined the radio with professional fascination. This is museum-quality evidence of organized wartime resistance. The historical significance is enormous. But for Keiko, the most powerful items were the personal ones: a small wooden cross, a child's toy soldier, a woman's wedding ring tied with a note that read, "For my daughter, when this madness ends." These weren't just artifacts of war and resistance. They were reminders that every person Hana helped had been someone's child, parent, spouse, someone whose absence had left a hole in another life. The weight of all those individual stories, all those moments of desperate hope, settled on Keiko's shoulders like a responsibility she was only beginning to understand. From the very bottom of the storage area, Hiroshi withdrew a folder that looked distinctly modern compared to everything else they had found. Inside were letters postmarked within the last 5 years, written on letterhead from the Canadian Veterans Affairs Office. "You started arriving about 6 years ago," Hiroshi said quietly. "At first, just inquiries about records from this region during the war. But then they became more specific. Someone was looking for information about a network that helped Allied prisoners escape through the Central Mountains. Someone who claimed to have been helped by a young Japanese woman named Hana in 1943. Keiko's heart began to race as she read the letters. They were written by someone acting on behalf of a veteran named Robert Sullivan, now 94 years old, living in a care facility in Victoria, British Columbia. The most recent letter, dated just 4 months ago, included a photograph, an elderly man with white hair and blue eyes, holding a brass compass identical to the one in Keiko's pocket. The letter explained that Mr. Sullivan had never stopped hoping to return to Japan, to find the woman who had saved his life, to fulfill a promise he had made in 1943. His health was failing, but his memory of those few weeks in the mountains remained crystal clear. He wanted to thank her, to explain why he had never come back, to make sure she knew that 70 years later, he still remembered everything she had done. The letter trembled in Keiko's hands as she read it a second time, barely able to believe what she was seeing. Her grandmother's lost love was still alive. The young man in the photograph, the one who had promised to return, had spent 70 years carrying his own brass compass and hoping for a chance to keep that promise. "Why didn't grandmother know about these letters?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Hiroshi's expression grew sad. "She died 6 months before the first one arrived. If she had lived just a little longer..." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Emma, reading over Keiko's shoulder, was already thinking practically. "We could contact him. The address is right here. He might not have much time left, but..." She looked at Keiko carefully. Would you want to? Would you want to complete a story that started before you were born?" Keiko looked down at the compass, its needle now pointing steadily toward the north, toward Canada, toward a man who had carried the memory of her grandmother's kindness for 7 decades. The answer came to her with surprising clarity. "He kept his promise to remember her," she said. "Now it's my turn to keep my promise to her. Somehow, I need to help him finish this story." The call to Victoria, British Columbia, took 3 attempts and the help of 2 translators, but finally they reached someone at the care facility who understood what they were looking for. Robert Sullivan was indeed still alive, though frail, and yes, he still spoke often about his time in Japan during the war. Yes, he had a compass, and yes, he had been trying for years to find information about the woman who had saved his life. When the facility staff member understood that they were calling from Shirakawa, from the actual village where he had hidden in 1943, there was a long pause followed by excited conversation in the background. "He's been waiting his whole life for this call," the woman finally said. "Can you hold while we bring him to the phone? He may need a few minutes. He's quite elderly, but I know he'll want to speak with you." Keiko's hands shook as she waited, Emma holding one hand while Hiroshi squeezed her shoulder encouragingly. After 70 years, 2 continents, and 3 generations, A conversation was about to happen that would finally complete a circle that had been left open since 1943. The compass on the table beside her seemed to pulse with anticipation, as if it too knew that its long journey was almost over. When Robert Sullivan's voice came through the phone, weak but unmistakably warm, Keiko felt as if she was speaking directly to the past. "Is this really Hannah's granddaughter?" he asked, and she could hear him crying softly on the other end of the line. "I never stopped hoping, but I thought I had missed my chance." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "Your grandmother saved my life, you know, not just from the war, but from becoming the kind of person who gives up on promises. I spent 70 years trying to get back to her, trying to find a way to say thank you, trying to keep the promise I made." Keiko found herself crying too, overwhelmed by the emotion in his voice, by the realization that her grandmother had been loved and remembered across all these decades. "She kept your compass," she managed to say. "She left it to me, and it led me to everything, to the networks, to the farmhouse, to the truth about who she really was." There was a long pause, and then Robert's voice came back even stronger than before. "Then she kept her promise too. She promised that someday someone would understand the importance of what we did together. She promised that the story wouldn't be lost." After the call ended, Keiko needed time alone to process everything that had happened. She walked through Shirakawa's quiet streets, past houses where people she had known her entire life were settling in for the evening, past the shrine where this journey had begun just days earlier. But everything looked different now. The familiar had become extraordinary. The simple had revealed its complexity, and the quiet mountain town she had always known held secrets that connected to lives across the world. She thought about her grandmother, young and brave, making dangerous choices because they were the right choices. She thought about Robert Sullivan, spending a lifetime carrying gratitude and love across an ocean. She thought about the dozens of people whose lives had been saved by a network of ordinary villagers who had decided to be extraordinary when circumstances demanded it. And she thought about herself, quiet, invisible Keiko, who had always assumed she was meant for small, safe things. Perhaps courage wasn't something you were born with. Perhaps it was something you discovered when you finally understood that some stories were more important than comfort, some promises more vital than safety. The compass in her pocket had gone quiet, but she no longer needed its guidance. She knew what she had to do. The morning brought clarity and purpose. Keiko had invited Emma to her grandmother's house to plan their next steps, and together they sat at Hannah's old writing desk, surrounded by all the evidence they had gathered. The photographs, maps, letters, and documents told an incredible story, but Emma's historian training helped them see what was missing. "We need to document everything properly," Emma explained, her notebook filling with careful diagrams and timelines. "This isn't just a family story anymore. It's historical evidence that could change how people understand wartime resistance in rural Japan. But more than that, it's a story about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, and those stories need to be told." Keiko found herself energized by Emma's enthusiasm and expertise. For the first time in her life, she felt like she was part of something important, something that mattered beyond her small, safe world. "I want to write a book," she said suddenly, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "Not just about grandmother, but about all the people in the network, all the lives that were saved, all the promises that were kept and broken and kept again." Emma's face lit up. "We could write it together. Your family connection and my research skills. We could make sure this story is preserved properly, told accurately, honored the way it deserves to be." Taro arrived at the house looking nothing like the angry man who had confronted them at the shrine. His business suit was replaced by casual clothes, his stern expression softened by what looked like a sleepless night of thinking. "Keiko," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology. And I owe grandmother an apology too, though it's too late for that." He looked genuinely ashamed as he continued. "I spent so many years trying to build a respectable, modern life that I forgot there are some things more important than reputation, some legacies more valuable than social standing." Keiko invited him inside, and as they sat in her grandmother's living room, surrounded by the evidence of Hannah's remarkable life, Taro's defensive anger melted away entirely. I was afraid, he admitted. Afraid that if people knew grandmother had been involved in resistance activities, it would somehow reflect badly on our family. But looking at all this, he gestured at the photographs and documents. I see now that I had it exactly backward. This is something to be proud of, something to honor. Grandmother wasn't just a good woman, she was a hero. Keiko felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Having her family's support for this journey meant more than she had realized. Will you help us? She asked. Help us make sure her story is told properly? Taro nodded firmly. Whatever you need. With Taro's support and Emma's expertise, the work of properly documenting grandmother's network proceeded rapidly. They created careful catalogues of every photograph, every map, every piece of correspondence. Emma's camera captured high-resolution images of fragile documents, while Taro used his business connections to locate professional archival materials for preservation. Keiko found herself taking naturally to the role of storyteller, conducting interviews with elderly residents who were finally willing to share memories they had kept secret for decades. Each conversation revealed new details about the network's operations, new stories of courage and sacrifice that deserved to be remembered. Mrs. Nakamura helped hide supplies in her root cellar, Keiko noted, writing carefully in her grandmother's old journal. Mr. Sato's father guided people through the most dangerous mountain passes. The entire community was involved, but they all kept the secret to protect each other. Emma watched with admiration as Keiko transformed from the quiet, self-doubting woman she had met at the shrine into a confident guardian of these important stories. You're becoming exactly what your grandmother hoped you would become, she observed. Someone who understands that preserving the truth is worth the risk. The compass lay open on the table among all the documents, its needle now pointing steadily north, as if it had finally completed its mission and was ready to rest. The video call with Robert Sullivan was Emma's idea, but seeing his face transformed everything for Keiko. Despite his age and frailty, his eyes were sharp and kind, exactly like the young man in the photograph from 1943. He held up his own compass to the camera, and Keiko held up hers, the matching instruments connecting across continents like a bridge through time. Your grandmother, Robert said, his voice stronger than it had been during their first phone conversation, was the bravest person I ever met, and the kindest. She risked everything to help strangers, not because she had to, but because she couldn't live with herself if she didn't. He told them stories they hadn't found in any documents, how Hannah had sat up all night nursing him through a fever, how she had taught him to move silently through the forest, how she had shared her own food when supplies ran low. I loved her, he said simply. I tried to get back to her after the war, but the world was chaos then. Communications were impossible, borders were closed. By the time I could have made the journey, I was married to someone else, starting a family. I never stopped regretting that I couldn't keep my promise. Keiko saw tears in his eyes as he continued. But now I see that she kept it for both of us. She made sure the story would survive, that someone would understand what we did together, what it meant. That evening, alone in her grandmother's house, Keiko began writing the book that would tell the full story of the Shirakawa Takayama network. She used her grandmother's old fountain pen and wrote in the journal Hannah had kept during the war years, feeling a direct connection to the woman who had lived these experiences. The compass pointed true, she began. Not toward magnetic north, but toward the truth that ordinary people become extraordinary when love and courage guide their choices. As she wrote, she felt her grandmother's presence in the room, not as a ghost or spirit, but as a continuation of purpose, a passing of responsibility from one generation to the next. Every story she captured was a life that had been saved, a family that had been kept together, a moment when humanity had triumphed over hatred. The words flowed easily, as if they had been waiting inside her all along, waiting for her to become brave enough to tell them. She wrote about Robert's courage in escaping, about Hannah's courage in helping, about the entire community's courage in keeping secrets that protected lives. She wrote about love that lasted 70 years, about promises that time couldn't break, about the way heroism often looked like quiet determination rather than dramatic action. Outside her window, the cherry blossoms continued to fall, marking the passage of seasons, the continuity of life, the way beauty persists even after individual flowers fade. The memorial garden that Hannah had secretly maintained for 70 years needed renewal, and Keiko felt called to continue her grandmother's work. With Emma's help, she planted new flowers and small trees, creating a living tribute to all the people whose lives had been touched by the resistance network. Each plant represented someone who had been helped, the prisoners who had escaped, the families who had been protected, the villagers who had risked everything to do what was right. They found Hannah's carefully kept records hidden beneath a loose stone, names, dates, sometimes just initials when full names were too dangerous to write down. Some entries were heartbreaking. Family with 3 children, lost contact after Nagoya, or young soldier, died of injuries before reaching safety. Others were triumphant, safe arrival in Allied territory confirmed, or reunited with family in Australia, 1947. As they worked, Keiko realized this garden was more than a memorial. It was a promise renewed. A commitment to remember, to honor, to ensure that these stories of courage and sacrifice would never be forgotten. Your grandmother understood something important, Emma observed, carefully planting a small cherry tree that would bloom for decades to come. She understood that memory is an active thing. It doesn't preserve itself. Someone has to tend it, protect it, help it grow. Keiko nodded, her hands deep in the earth, feeling connected to all the people who had come before and all who would come after. The village meeting was Hiroshi's suggestion. After decades of keeping secrets, it was time for the community to understand the full scope of what their neighbors and families had accomplished during the war years. Keiko had been nervous about speaking publicly, but as she stood before 24 villagers in Shirakawa's small community center, she felt her grandmother's courage flowing through her. Many of you suspected that unusual things happened in our village during the war, she began, displaying the photographs and maps they had discovered. Tonight, I want to tell you the truth about what your parents and grandparents accomplished here and why it matters that we remember. As she told the story of the resistance network, she watched faces in the audience change from curiosity to amazement to pride. Mrs. Tanaka gasped when she recognized her late father in one of the photographs. Mr. Yoshida nodded knowingly when Keiko described the supply caches. He had found strange items while hiking years earlier, but never understood their significance. Your families were heroes, Keiko concluded, her voice strong and clear. They saved lives, they protected the innocent, and they proved that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they choose love over fear. The applause that followed was warm and sustained, but more importantly, the conversations that began that night would continue for months, as families finally shared stories they had kept hidden, as the community began to understand its own remarkable history. The book took shape over 6 months of intensive work. Keiko found herself transformed by the writing process, discovering abilities she never knew she possessed. Emma's research skills, combined with Keiko's storytelling instincts, created a narrative that was both historically accurate and deeply moving. They interviewed dozens of family members, tracked down records in multiple archives, and even connected with survivors in other countries who had been helped by similar networks. The story that emerged was larger and more important than either of them had initially imagined. It wasn't just about Hannah and Robert, or even about the Shirakawa-Takayama network. It was about the way ordinary communities could become extraordinary when faced with moral choices, about the ripple effects of individual courage, about the importance of remembering stories that might otherwise be lost. Publishers expressed immediate interest, recognizing both the historical significance and the universal human appeal of the story. But for Keiko, the real satisfaction came from knowing that her grandmother's legacy was finally being honored properly, that the people who had risked everything to help others would be remembered and celebrated. Late at night, working by lamplight at her grandmother's desk, she often felt as if Hannah were sitting beside her, guiding her words, helping her find the right way to tell these precious stories. The compass lay beside her manuscript, its work complete, but its presence still meaningful. a reminder of the power of love and promises to transcend time. Robert Sullivan's health had declined significantly over the months of their correspondence, but he insisted on one final video call when Keiko told him the book was complete. When he appeared on screen, she could see that he was very frail, but his eyes were bright with anticipation. "May I see it?" he asked softly, and Keiko held up the completed manuscript, its pages thick with months of careful research and writing. "The Memory Keeper's Promise, a story of love, courage and connection across time," she read from the title page. Robert smiled, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "She kept her promise," he whispered, "and now you've kept yours. The story won't be lost." They talked for nearly an hour, with Robert sharing final memories and Keiko reading him passages from the book that particularly honoured his experience and his love for her grandmother. "I can go peacefully now," he said near the end of the call. "I never made it back to Japan in person, but through you, through this book, I finally completed the journey. Tell everyone who reads it that love doesn't end when people die. Sometimes it just waits for the right person to carry it forward." When the call ended, Keiko sat quietly for a long time, holding the compass and feeling the weight of completion. The circle was finally closed, the promise finally kept, the story finally told. The book launch in Shirakawa drew people from across the region. Historians, journalists and residents from neighbouring villages joined the local community to hear Keiko read from The Memory Keeper's Promise. Standing where she had first spoken publicly about her grandmother's network, Keiko felt the transformation in herself and in her community's understanding of its own history. "This book began with a compass that pointed toward truth instead of north," she told the assembled crowd. "It led me to discover that heroism often looks like quiet determination, that love can last across decades and continents, and that the most important stories are sometimes the ones people keep secret to protect others." The local newspaper reporter scribbled notes frantically, recognizing that this was more than just a book launch. It was the revelation of a significant piece of regional history that had been hidden for 70 years. A representative from the National Museum expressed interest in creating an exhibition based on the artifacts and documents Keiko had preserved. But the moment that meant most to her came when Mrs. Yamada, 91 years old, approached after the reading. "My mother helped your grandmother," she whispered. "She made me promise never to tell, but now that the story is finally being honoured, I can say how proud I was of her." As the evening ended and people lingered to examine the photographs and maps on display, Keiko realized that her quiet mountain town would never be quite the same. The hidden history was now part of its public identity, a source of pride rather than secrecy. 1 year later, the memorial garden had become a place of pilgrimage for people from around the world. Keiko received letters from descendants of people her grandmother had helped, from historians studying wartime resistance networks, from readers who found inspiration in the story of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. As she tended the flowers on this spring morning, exactly 2 years after she had first found the compass, she read through the latest batch of correspondence. A family in Australia had discovered that their grandfather was one of the prisoners Hannah helped escape. A researcher in Germany was documenting similar networks that operated throughout occupied Europe. A high school class in Canada was studying the book as part of their unit on courage and moral choice. Each letter reminded her that her grandmother's story had touched lives she would never meet, had inspired courage she would never witness directly. The compass lay beside her on the garden bench, no longer mysterious but still precious, a reminder that some journeys begin long before we realize we're traveling, and some destinations are more important than we could ever imagine when we take the first step.